Our first presenter is Howard Olson. Howard is the Senior Vice President of Government and Public Affairs with Ag Country Farm Credit Services here in Fargo. Please welcome Howard Olson.
Thank you, Dan. And thank you, Dan, and thank you to Charlie for inviting me here. Thank you to all of you that are watching this online. A little bit different than what we've done the last few years at this marketing update meeting. And we'll see how this goes. Hopefully it works well for everyone. Today I want to talk about, wait for the presentation to pop up. Hit which button? Being the first speaker, there's a few bugs to work out, right? Got it. Thank you, Grant. All right. I'm going to talk about ag policy and its influence on marketing today. What we're going to look at today is some of our ag policy, the farm programs and the disaster programs. I'm going to touch briefly on trade and other markets and uses. Take a look at the policy influence on marketing, if any. And then take a look at some election scenarios, possible election scenarios, and how that could impact the ag policy. We've got a real alphabet soup of farm programs out there, farm and disaster programs. And I'm not going to go into these in detail. Most of you are probably very familiar with them, probably more familiar than I am even. But we've got a couple that are part of the farm bill that we have, and this is the True Farm Program. These are here to help protect farmers against the cyclical nature of crop prices and both in seasonal yields and so on. The ARC County and the ARC Individual and the PLC. We've got the WHIP Plus program that came out originally in 2018 for wildfires and hurricane indemnity program, and then the Plus was added in 2019 as a result of some severe spring flooding in the Midwest and our snowstorms up here in early October of 18 and again in 19. The MFP, the Market Facilitation Program, came out as in 2019, but was a result of the 2018 trade war with China. We'll touch on that in a little bit. One of the things is right from the FSA website. It says farmers.gov. This is for producers whose commodities have been directly impacted by unjustified foreign retaliatory tariffs, resulting in the loss of traditional export markets. I find it interesting that FSA puts on their website that kind of editorializing here that these are unjustified. And just yesterday, the WTO came out with a finding that the U.S. tariffs on the Chinese goods was unjustified. So I guess it all depends on which side of the glass you're looking at or your perspective here. This summer, we were introduced to the CFAP program, the Coronavirus Food and Assistance Program. We'll touch on that a little bit more as well in just a minute. This was a part of the CARES package. There is talk right now of a CFAP 2. And in fact, a few weeks ago, the Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary Perdue, announced that there would be a CFAP 2 payment, and details would come out right after Labor Day, and we are still waiting for that information at this point. So we'll see what happens with that. And then the Paycheck Protection Program was a loan program. This was a forgivable loan available for producers, and farmers were eligible for this. This was available for businesses around the country, but the one program where farmers were eligible. And it helped out some, I think, for a lot of producers. At Ag Country, we averaged right around $20,000 was the average loan size on this. The forgiveness process would be starting right about now. And so that program. And then there's a number of livestock and conservation programs. We're not going to get into all of those, but that's things like our CRP and like the dairy margin coverage and so on. Wanted to spend a few minutes, though, on this slide. This shows the government farm program payments to farm producers from 2010 to 2020, and 20 is a forecast. This comes from the USDA Economic Research Service. And we take a look here from 10 to 20, and the bottom blue line is the conservation payments that have been paid out over the years. This gray over here on the left is the fixed payments from previous farm bills. This was the direct payments that we used to have, and they have been replaced by payments that are a function of crop prices. This is the ARC and the PLC payments. And then we see starting here with the market facilitation payments in the gold, and then the red is all other program payments. So this is the CFAP, this is the PPP, and other ad hoc disaster assistance and so on. But I think what's interesting is we take a look at 2016, and this is roughly around $12, $13 billion. And we get up here to 2020 and a forecast of somewhere around $38 billion in program payments to farm producers. So pretty significant increase during this last administration. Touch on trade just real briefly. Again, there's a whole alphabet soup of trade programs out there as well. Some of them have been around for quite some time, like the CAFTA, the Central American and Dominican Republic trade. We had NAFTA, and that's been replaced with the USMCA. There were some trade agreements almost in place, and then we didn't sign, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And again, this administration looking more at unilateral agreements rather than multilateral. China, tariffs, again, that's certainly a trade issue, 2018, and we had the China Phase 1 deal now in 2020 that was just signed. We'll touch on that in a minute here too. And then there's many other multilateral and unilateral agreements. And then we also have trade disagreements, and I think everyone is very well familiar with the tariffs that were announced in 2018. And we just take a look at the impact of what it did to our price here on soybeans, and you see some of what happened with the futures from May to July, the basis at the same time period, the cash price. You know, we've got a loss of almost $3 a bushel in about a month and a half here of value on our beans. And then we hit a worldwide pandemic in January, and it started in China. And again, certainly had to impact that trade and the global trade. We lost over $1 in futures from that one. Interesting enough, the basis improved during that time from about $1.20 under to 90 under. And perhaps Betsy and Frayne will touch on that a little bit in a few minutes. But it's still loss of about $1 of the cash price. So not only trade agreements are certainly good, but these trade disagreements can certainly be bad for us as well, as we've all experienced. The China Phase 1 tracker, I thought this was interesting. We've seen a lot of purchases in the last few weeks from China, and we hear news of these in the shiploads and so on being purchased. And there is a website. If you just Google China Phase 1 tracker, this website will come up, and it shows you where China is at. And we've heard all year long that they are behind on their Phase 1 agreement. It'll be interesting to see. The dotted line shows where they should be if you just took this across on a monthly average for the year at 33.4 billion of purchases. At the end of July, they were at 7.6 billion. There was more purchases in August that were made, but it'll be interesting to see if this catches up to that 33.4 billion by the end of the year. There's a lot of speculation in the markets that it won't, but we'll wait and see. This is some information that was available from NDSU, and it just shows the contribution of the farm program payments and exports relative to the gross cash income on the farm. You see here in 2018, our farm program payments were about 8% of the gross cash income on the farm income. Exports, meanwhile, over 44%. And I think the thing, one thing to note here, we go back about 18 years to 2000, and you see exports at just 29% of the farm income. So significant increase over the last 18 years, and certainly a significant importance to the farms. It'll be interesting now as these numbers are updated for 2019 and 20 to see where that comes out at. And then other uses of markets. And for example, ethanol, or corn being used for ethanol, and the renewable fuel standard, the RFS. This is a table that shows the weekly ethanol production in the United States, and it goes back to 2010. But you see right at the end here what happens, this significant drop off like a cliff here of production. And this is what happens when we have a global pandemic that just kills the demand for fuel and oil, because transportation demands die. And at the same time, the Russians and Saudi Arabians have an oil price war. It kills both the demand and the price for oil and for ethanol too. And this comes right back home to our farmers and to you folks out there. Many of you perhaps had, or some of you perhaps had contracts even that were canceled. You're not able to deliver corn, or perhaps your ethanol plant was only taking certain days of the week. So the influence on marketing, how do we, if at all, does this trade policy influence marketing? Let's just walk through a real quick example. And I just took 2019 because we've got program income or program payments from 2019. We know pretty much what they're going to be. And I just use Richland County, assume a break even of $8.75 a bushel and a 45 bushel average yield. We had an MFP payment in 2019 for that 2019 crop. And let me back up, that MFP came part of it in 19 and part in January of 20. But if in Richland County, it was $55 an acre, flat payment per acre. And if we assume that 45 bushel average, that's about $1.22 an acre we can put on our soybeans. Excuse me, $1.22 per bushel we can put on our soybeans. Now we look at CFAP, that's a little more complicated. The CFAP was paid on the lesser of 50% of your production or unsold bushels as of January 15th. So let's just assume you produced 50,000 bushels for a nice round number. You sold all of it prior to January 15th, you would not get a CFAP payment on those beans. However, if that same 50,000 bushels of beans was sitting unpriced in your bin, it was still there on April 16th, and the value on it at that time would have been about $7.52 a bushel, but the CFAP would have paid on half of that, or 25,000 bushels, and the payment was 47.5 cents a bushel. Now, take that and divide it over the 50,000 bushels, it's equivalent to about 23.75 cents a bushel. So we plugged those into a couple scenarios. If you'd sold all your beans on October 2nd, there was about a 90 under basis at that time. You would have gotten about an 832 cash sale, add on the MFP, and your revenue per bushel, 954, the break even 875. You made about 79 cents a bushel profit on those beans. If you'd waited and sold them all, just for example, on April 16th, the price had dropped significantly that time. You would have still had the MFP, add in this CFAP payment, but your revenue was about 898 and about 23 cents a bushel profit on it. I think one thing to note with this, look at that MFP payment of $1.22. Either one of these scenarios, you would have lost money if we did not have that MFP payment. And we've been telling our legislators in Washington that that MFP was certainly beneficial and made the difference between people losing a lot of money or losing a little money on their beans or on any of the crops, or perhaps making a little bit. So it's certainly significant. But in these examples, that producer who sold ahead actually had a $28,000 profit advantage over the one that waited. Now, if you're still sitting on those 2019 beans in your bin, you're probably looking pretty smart right now with the rally that we've had in the last month. But how many producers do that, and how often does that work out to the good? So I think, the government payments certainly help. They're a good way to smooth the cash flow needs, but they're really a Band-Aid. They won't make you whole. And consider that $1.22 MFP payment. Without that payment, both sales examples would have lost money. We don't always know if they're going to happen or when they're going to happen. They're generally not timely. That CFAP payment from this summer of 2020 is just getting, it was based on the last year's crop. Our ARC and PLC payments that would be coming out in October are for the 2019 crop. So look at the timeliness, the delay. I think another thing to keep in mind here, 2021 is not an election year. So will there be any ad hoc relief money? Big question mark on that one. So the influence on marketing, well, you still need a marketing plan. And I think everyone is aware of this, but just to reinforce that, and it's got to be based on your cost of production. Have your price targets over a break even. Put some sales deadlines in place based on seasonal patterns. So if those price targets are not met, and then don't get analysis paralysis waiting for ad hoc payments. Don't be the guy sitting with the soybeans still in your bin because you knew there was going to be a big rally here a year later in beans. So to wrap up this part of it, I think we need farm programs to help manage that seasonal and cyclical risk. They certainly need, like the ARC and the PLC, our conservation programs, our crop insurance programs. We need trade agreements and we need these trade programs. We need alternative markets and uses like the renewable fuels. And I think one thing that we need up in this area that we need more of is animal agriculture too, as another use of our local grain. And with that, we need livestock friendly regulations to help promote and support that animal agriculture. And yet at the same time, we've got to balance that with environmental friendly practices, to be a good neighbor to our city cousins. So let's move on and take a look at some election scenarios and the possible impact on ag policy. The information here is from a 2020 election scenario planner that was created by the National Journal Presentation Center. They took a look at 8 different election scenarios based on outcomes of the president, that the House is controlled by Democrats or Republicans and the Senate controlled by Democrats or Republicans. And there's 3 that we're just going to drill down here and probably the most likely. So scenario 1 is pretty much status quo. President Trump is reelected. The House stays in the Democrat control. The Senate stays in Republican control. They look at this as the likelihood is high and pretty much a status quo outcome. The next scenario we'll look at is number 5 down here, where Vice President Biden is elected president, the House stays with Democrats and the Senate stays with the Republicans. And then the third one that we'll look at is Vice President Biden is elected president, the House stays with the Democrats and the Senate switches to Republican. Now, that's going to be more of a challenge, but it's possible. And especially if Biden wins significantly, people voting down that party line on the ballot, if Biden has a significant win, it could pull enough senators along with that too to flip the Senate to the Democrats. So we'll look at those three scenarios. Before we get into that, the polls, you hear a poll from Washington Post and a poll from ABC and a poll from this and from that. How do you know which ones to go on? Well, there is a website, Real Clear Politics, that takes an average of all of these polls. And they're showing right now the states that are lean or are likely Biden, the states that lean are likely Trump, and then the toss-ups. And these are the electoral votes. There's 200 electoral votes they consider as toss-ups. And we look right close by here, Minnesota. You've all heard the advertising, have seen the news. Minnesota is very much a toss-up state at this point. The Republicans and President Trump believes that they really believe they can win Minnesota, which has not voted for a Republican president since Richard Nixon. So that would be a significant switch if Minnesota went Republican. The average of the polls this last week up to September 13th, Biden had a 7.4 lead. I looked this up just a few hours ago and they've updated it to the past 5 days, and that lead has dropped now to 6.9 points. In the Senate, there's 100 seats in the Senate. Right now, there's 46 leaning Democrat, 46 leaning Republican. There's 8 that are considered toss-ups in this election. And again, only a third of the Senate seats are up for election in any given year. In the House, 435 total seats. They're all up for election every 2 years. Need 218 for a majority. The Democrats currently hold 232. On the Real Clear Politics, they're looking at that 190 lean or are likely Republican, and there's 31 toss-ups. So the Republicans need 28 of those toss-ups, 28 out of the 31, which is probably not going to happen. So in all the scenarios, we're looking at that the House will stay with the Democrats. So again, we'll look at these three and specifically the impact to ag policy. First scenario one, if President Trump is reelected, the House stays with the Democrats, the Senate stay with Republican, status quo, very much continuation of where we're at. The overall policy priorities will be a continued focus on trade and tariff, the trade imbalances and tariffs on goods, the potential for increased farm immigration enforcement. The administration will remain very industry friendly with greater flexibility in the meat processing systems, EPA siding with industry on pesticides, Congress likely to continue the commodity support program, our farm programs. And the key impacts in the industry would be, we'll probably continue to see trade disputes and more tariffs on U.S. ag products and threatening access to foreign markets. National Journal Presentation Center feels that the economic impact payments will likely be continued. I'd question that one. I just, I'm not going to argue. These guys are a lot smarter than I am, but boy, history just tells us in a non-election year, we'll see. Let's go to the next scenario. This is where Vice President Biden is president. The House stays with the Democrats and the Senate stays with the Republicans. So this one, we're probably not going to see a lot of significant changes, but because we still got this gridlock between the two houses of Congress, between the House and the Senate. But this will pick up where Obama left off. Where we will see a changes is administrative changes with farm program eligibility restrictions. Their priorities will be on stricter animal welfare standards, reforming contract farming, and so on. The impacts that we'll see is that they'll continue to support the ag safety net, but they'll be less industry friendly in labor and environmental disputes. You think about things like waters of the U.S. and some of the other environmental regulations and so on that have changed since Trump was elected president. Well, we could see a lot of that switching back. Modest expansion in farm conservation practices and land reserves, but it can't be much because, again, this is part of the Farm Bill and would take active Congress to change those types of things. And then the third scenario that's possible is that Biden is elected president, the House stays with the Democrats, and the Senate switches to the Democrats. It'll be more difficult for them to win the Senate, but it's not impossible. The policy priorities in this case would be expanded supports to move more farmers into organic production. We'll see increased conservation spending. But again, this is going to have to take a change in the Farm Bill to do some of that. And even though the Democrats might hold the Senate, many of the bills in the Senate need 60% majority to pass. So significant change is still going to be difficult to get and to happen. Their priorities are going to continue for decreased support for corporate-owned farms and stricter animal welfare standards, I think, are a couple of the bigger ones that we'll see. Impacts to the industry, less industry-friendly, and labor and environmental disputes, just like we talked about on the previous scenario. The ag safety net likely examined for impacts on environment and health. I think decreased farm program income for larger farms. I think this type of scenario might be very favorable for small farms, but I think for the larger farms that we have, especially up in this area, it could be a bit more detrimental because the program payments to those larger farms. So the three scenarios, I think drilling down to a couple particular areas, crop supports. This table shows the Republican president, and if it's a Republican House and Senate, we don't need to look at that one, but we look at this column, Democrat House, Republican Senate, and some of what's likely and not. Over here, Democrat president, Democrat House, Democrat Senate, what's likely. So again, expand into conservation programs, eliminate them, very unlikely on any scenario. Tighten farm program income and payment limits. We'll see this on the crop insurance. They say possible. I think the National Journal Presentation Center is saying possible in these because the president has had cuts in these areas in his budget the last few years, and the presidents before them, the last 2 or 3 presidents have had cuts in these areas. So I think that's why they put them in there. I don't know that we'd see much of that. Crop insurance, the other area, they're pretty much in agreement. We're going to continue to see expansion of hemp crop insurance coverage, regardless of who's elected. Tighten the crop insurance income restrictions. I think this would be in that adjusted gross income limit, and would they get that built into the crop insurance? Again, that's probably something would have to happen in the Farm Bill. Reduce crop insurance funding is very unlikely. Cap the underwriting profits possible, but again, I would say probably not. So I think in summary here, the ag policies, farm programs, we need them, but don't rely on them. Trade, other markets and uses, we need them, but don't rely on just one. And we saw that with our soybeans, we saw that with our corn market and ethanol. The policy influence on marketing, when Charlie called me and asked to talk about this, and I said, does ag policy really have an impact or an influence on marketing? And I think that we could debate that over beers for a long time. But should it? Bottom line is you still need to have a plan, and you need to follow the plan. And then election and ag policy, there'll be some changes, but how much? Plan for possible changes, but that focus still needs to be on the operations and on marketing. Every year, every election, every presidential election, you hear people say, oh, if President Trump wins, I'm moving to Canada. Oh, if Hillary wins, I'm moving to Canada. Well, people might say that, but don't pack the U-Haul yet. It's not going to be those kinds of significant changes that we'll see, but some things that we need to think about and be ready for. So with that, thank you again for inviting me here, and we'll see if we have any questions.
None right now.
No questions. I'm off the hook.
No, you're not.
Brett?
I do have a question. Early on, you talked about large farms, okay? Not this last section, but early on. How do these policy analysts, how do they pigeonhole a large farm? What is it in their mind? Is there any kind of documentation that says this is a big farm and this isn't a big farm, or this is the corporate-owned farm and this isn't?
So just in case the question, Grant, would the question have been picked up on the mics? In case people didn't hear it, Brett asked, how do the policy geeks pigeonhole the large farms? What's the definition? USDA has a standard, first of all, small farms. It's different in different departments. At the Farm Credit Administration, it's $250,000 of gross income or less as a small farm. I think USDA is $350,000. Large farm, I believe they categorize that at $1 million of gross farm income, or the value of farm production, and larger. But where it comes into play is in the program limits and certainly in the ARC and the PLC, and we have the per person cap, and then we have the adjusted gross income caps and so on. So they're looking at that as the payment caps and the AGI caps they have in place. Very good. Dan?